Alright, okay, we're coming in today for our little next video. So, no, I know it's been a couple weeks, but we're going to go ahead and do our next video that we had planned here, which I decided that we're going to go ahead and probably do the next 3 presidents' videos relatively close together, only because upon further kind of study of the 3 presidents, I deemed it would probably be more beneficial to do them to do these 3 in more of a consecutive time frame because of the relationship that each of the administrations of these presidents kind of had on each other. They kind of followed each other pretty closely and had an impact on the succeeding or preceding one. So for the next 3 presidential videos, we're going to try to knock them out here pretty close together, only because of the relative relation that they really had to each other compared to other presidential administrations. They very much were in a successional order where the actions of the previous administration had directly influenced that of the next. So that is what we're going to plan to do here. So we are going to go ahead here, and this is our 6th president's video. Yeah, 6. So this, of course, would be the 6th President of the United States. The last time that we touched up on the President series, we did the 5th President, James Monroe, who was President from 1817 to 1825. And we mentioned that that would be the last of the founders to become president. Monroe was really the last of the founding generation to become a president. He was the last that had actually fought in the American Revolution. He was the last to come from that time frame. And now you're getting a whole new generation of Americans that are starting to that didn't fight in the Revolution, that are starting to come to political power. And the very first here that we will discuss is, give me just a second, flip through our notebook today. The very first of these new generation of presidents is our 6th president, John Quincy Adams, who, if you may recall, we had a president named John Adams as the 2nd president. Yes, there is a relation. John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams. So this is one of the only 2 instances in history where you have a father and son president. The other one being much more recent, where you had George H.W. Bush from 1989 to 1993, and then we had his son, George W. Bush, who was still alive, who became president from 2001 to 2009. So this is the only other instance in history where we have a father and son become president. And this is John Quincy. This is his little painting, I suppose we could call it, portrait, whatever you want to call. This is John Quincy. So, as always, let's go ahead here and we're going to discuss a little bit of background to John Quincy, exactly what his background was, where he came from, and what his accomplishments were prior to him getting in the office. I realized that before. Something on my computer. Anyway, so of course, let's go ahead and start with the background. John Quincy Adams was born, as we mentioned, he is the son of former President John Adams and founding father John Adams, and he is his firstborn son. He was born on July 11th in 1767, right before the American Revolution. You could call it the eve of the American Revolution. So he was still not born an American citizen. He was not the first president to be born an American citizen. He was still born, when he was born, the United States was not in existence yet. It was still the British colonies. So we haven't reached that stage yet. He was born in what was at the time called Braintree, Massachusetts. This was the name of the town. Nowadays it's called Quincy, probably after John. But he was born in Massachusetts just like his father before him and many members of his family prior. Now, John was, although he was the first son to John and his wife, Abigail, he was not their first child. He was actually their second child, but he was their first son. Now, Adams grew up, of course, during the period of the American Revolution, and thus he got to see a lot of, due to his family's patriot sentiments, especially that of his father and his mother, he really got to see a lot of events of the early American Revolution very firsthand, especially considering that the Adams lived not too far out of Boston, where during the first few months of the conflict, that was where I actually say for the first year of the American Revolution, that's where a lot of the early battles took place around Boston, like Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. A lot of the earlier actions happened around Boston, and thus they really got to have a first-hand witness to these events. And Adams personally actually watched the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775 from a nearby hilltop of his mother. So he very much grew up during the American Revolution, and thus he wasn't really indoctrinated in British ways as much as his father would have been growing up because the American colonies are starting to break away from Britain. Now, young John Quincy, later as the years went on, later in the Revolution, he actually starts accompanying his father on his diplomacy missions to Europe that the Continental Congress was sending John Adams on. And John Quincy was actually coming along with John on these trips. And he actually started coming with him at the relatively young age of 10. Now, Adams received much of his education due to his travels with his father. He received a lot of his education actually over in Europe, which, of course, meant he got to study immensely compared to what was available in the colonies. He studied at many universities in multiple different countries, such as France and Britain, and even became fluent in 7 languages. Yes, this was probably, it has actually been disputed by scholars that John Quincy Adams may have been our most intelligent president that there has ever been because of the education that he had and because of his diplomatic travels. He had a lot of experience with other nations, he had a lot of educational background, and I mean, what other president have we heard of that's been able to speak 7 languages, including English? And almost every other major language there was of it at the time, at least, that was needed for diplomatically talking. But Adams received, of course, most of his education in Europe due to the travels that occurred there. He was actually with his father, I believe, when they went to uh, discuss with the British the terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that officially ended the American Revolution. I believe he was actually with his father at those talks, which ended up being signed and ended up being the formal treaty that ended the war and recognized the American independence. So, 2 years after the end of the American Revolution in 1783, so now we're in 1785, Adams returns back home to the United States, and he actually attends Harvard, which his father had attended before him, and it's actually supposedly in the Adams family. It's like a tradition for the members of that family to attend Harvard as their graduate school. That's like a family tradition, is to attend their family's alma mater. And he went and started attending Harvard in 1785. He graduated in 1787. Adams followed in his father's footsteps. He took up law. That's what he studied. If we may recall, John Adams had been a lawyer before the American Revolution and later turned into a politician. Well, this is very much the route that his son John Quincy took. He very much studies law, and in 1790 he's actually admitted to the bar and takes up practice in Boston. To the Massachusetts bar, they went ahead and admitted him in 1790. Now, during his law years, Adams actually was quite the defender of President George Washington, the new president, as the United States had established the office of the president after 1787 when it adopted the U.S. Constitution. And he defended President Washington on his policy of neutrality during the ongoing war between Britain and France during the 1790s, which at the time was quite controversial to many Americans and to the world because Britain and France, of course, France is in the middle of the French Revolution. It's a whole mess of chaos over there. Britain is starting to basically come bulldog fights again with France. And there's a lot of urging by both Britain and France, the United States, to support the one over the other. And of course, there's urging from many of the American citizens that favor one side or the other due to political reasons, due to ancestral ties, family ties, whatever they felt. And Washington ultimately decided that he knew the United States was not in any position to really get involved in the European war, that it was too young, it was too weak, it wasn't strong enough and developed enough yet, that if it got involved in this war, it would be destroyed. So he chose a policy of neutrality, basically saying, I'm not joining any side, we're just being neutral. Well, there were, of course, critics of this policy, believing that Washington was a betrayer of the revolution because he wouldn't side with France over Britain. or as others claim, that he wouldn't side with Britain to help stop France murdering its own people, such as its king. Well, John Quincy, during his law years, actually became quite the defending advocate of Washington's neutrality policy. And due to this, he actually gained Washington's attention, of course, because not just because he's a lawyer, not because he was a lawyer in Massachusetts, but the way he gains, of course, his attention is probably because John Adams was Washington's vice president. So it wasn't like Washington probably didn't hear about John Quincy every once in a while because his vice president was literally his father. So he probably heard about it from John. And Washington ultimately requested that John Quincy be his U.S. minister to the be his minister to the Netherlands, the United States minister to the Netherlands, which Adams accepted in 1794. Now, when John Adams becomes president in 1797, when Washington decides that he's not going to run for a third term, he declines. He goes ahead. He says, "I'm not going to run for a third term. Someone else has got to take the reins." There's an election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and John Adams wins. John Quincy's father is now president. When John Adams becomes president in 1797, he actually appoints his son as the minister to Prussia, which of course was a highly prestigious position given that Prussia was one of the major European powers at the time, of course. Now, Prussia is modern-day Germany. Now, while in London, while he was over in Europe, he stopped in London for a brief time, and then while he was there, Adams met and married a young woman by the name of Louisa Catherine Johnson. And she was actually the daughter of the American consul, but she was still born in Britain, so she was an English woman, which for some, they actually kind of saw that as a little scandalous, given that the United States had not too long ago gained its independence from Britain, but here goes the son of one of the most prominent founding fathers going and marrying an English woman. Now, John and Louisa eventually had they had 3 children. Unfortunately, it was not always a happy marriage, and most of their children died before their parents did. They had a daughter that died when she was just a baby, and they had both sons die before they even reached adulthood. So, in honesty, yeah, wasn't that good. And of course, as we mentioned, the marriage didn't always play out very well because for some reason later in life, John and Louisa constantly would argue over certain political ideals, mostly in relations between the United States and Britain because Louisa had actually been born there, and it kind of caused some conflict with John and her over the years as the United States kind of had a fluctuating relationship, and one felt one way toward their home country, and the other one felt the other way toward their home country, and it got a little hectic. And I mean, they did stay married of course, till John died first, but it was not always the happiest of marriages. Now, when John Adams loses the election of 1800, John Quincy is recalled back home from his post as the U.S. Minister to Prussia. As we may recall, John Adams was the first president to lose a re-election bid. He lost it to Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800. So, upon his father losing the election, he goes ahead, he calls John Quincy, says, "All right, I lost the election, son, come on home." And John Quincy comes back home and he returns to his law practice in Boston that he had left in 1794 when he had gone to join Washington's ambassadors. In 1802, John Quincy ends up being elected to the Massachusetts State Senate, and in 1803 he ends up going further and is elected to the U.S. Senate. So he's now a senator by 1803. Now, Adams was identified during his time in Congress as a Federalist, at least early in his career. And this had been the political party that his father had been part of. He was very much the Federalists interpreted a strict view of the Constitution and expansion of the government, basically. And Adams was constantly, early on in his career, was assumed that he was a Federalist. He identified with the party of his father, and thus he was considered one. However, although Adams did vote, John Quincy did vote with the Federalists on several issues that were related to their cause. Later in his career, later in the by around 1810, I would say, he starts kind of flipping in his political ideology, and particularly in the embargo of 1807, which was mostly a Democratic Republican, which was Thomas Jefferson's party. He very much supported that, which most Federalists did not, which kind of put him at odds with his own party. And he continued, as the years went on, he became more and more supportive of other policies from the other side than he was Federalist policies. Although he still identified as a Federalist, he wasn't exactly supporting their agenda. And this leads him to become very estranged from the Federalist Party, unlike his father had become. Unlike his father, who would never become estranged, John Quincy becomes estranged from the party of his father. He starts not fitting in, really, because he's not really voting for their agenda anymore. He's starting to vote more in line with the Democratic Republicans. So in 1808, John Quincy resigns his Senate seat, and he takes up a job as a professor at Harvard University up there in Massachusetts, his alma mater. In 1809, a year later, President Madison, James Madison, who was our fourth president, he calls John Quincy back to serve as the diplomatic ambassador to Tsar Alexander I of Russia. So he actually gets to not just go to Russia, he actually gets to go live in the Tsar's palace. He gets to go live in Tsar Alexander's palace over in St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace. He gets to be a guest there at the palace and a member of the Russian Tsar's court. Now, while he lived in St. Petersburg, he stayed there throughout most of the Madison administration, and he was there when Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812. Of course, ironically, right when the United States was in the middle of a war with Great Britain, but John Quincy was stuck in Russia at the time, and they're getting invaded by Napoleon. He was in St. Petersburg. He was witness to Napoleon's invasion and retreat from Russia in 1812. He saw it and witnessed much of it personally. Now, he did help to negotiate, in relation to the War of 1812, Adams did help to negotiate the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, which was signed in the city of Ghent in Belgium, and that would bring an end to the War of 1812. So he was very much starting to gain a reputation as a diplomatic negotiator. For the final years of President James Madison's presidency, Adams had his held his father's old post as U.S. Minister to Great Britain. John Adams had been the first United States Minister to Great Britain very early on in the United States' post-Revolution years, and John Quincy later held that very same post that his father had once held. In 1817, President James Monroe actually named John Quincy as his Secretary of State due to his diplomatic skills. And during this post as Secretary of State to President Monroe, John Quincy actually accomplishes two big things. First thing, he negotiates a joint occupation of the Oregon Territory with England, which happened in 1818, which had been disputed. The Oregon Territory had been very much, up until that point, been constantly disputed between the United States and England over who exactly owned it, and they constantly were coming to possible threats and blows from the settlers rushing into the territory and from the two opposing governments who were starting to come to the possibility that they might wage war over it. So he actually negotiates a joint occupation of the territory that would last for at least a while, for at least a good 20 to 30 years. And then his more significant accomplishment was through the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, he secures the Spanish territory of Florida from Spain, and he secures that under United States control. He basically acquires Florida for the United States and the southern parts of Mississippi and Alabama, which was the Spanish territory of West Florida. So, all you people that live in Orlando, Miami, Tallahassee, Keys, whatever you want to call it, all those cities down in Florida, if you're a Florida person, you can thank John Quincy that you're even part of this country, because he's the one that actually acquired you from the Spanish. Now, this was during his time as Secretary of State. Now, Adams later also helped President Monroe craft his very famous Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which, as we mentioned in the last presidential video, was basically this policy that the Americas were off limits to European colonization, that European powers were no longer allowed to colonize any region in the New World, be it North or South America, and that if any European country did try to colonize any of those areas, the United States was sworn to defend and protect them and would oppose them. Basically saying, if you come over here and try to colonize, you're going to war with the United States. Now, in 1824, President Monroe's 2 terms are up. He decides not to run for a 3rd term, which was still allowed at the time. So in 1824, Adams actually enters the presidential race, which, of course, he had a good history. I mean, he had long served as a major diplomatic figure in the United States diplomacy and diplomatic relations. He had been a Secretary of State. And of course, his father had been president. So, of course, he had a good background. He had a good resume, so to speak. So in 1824, he enters the presidential race against 4 other opponents, and they were from the same party. They were all from the Democratic Republican Party, which Adams had now officially started to identify himself with. And in 1824, he enters this race with 4 other opponents, and the opponents were all from the same party because the Federalist Party, which had long been the other mainstay of political power in the United States since basically the 1790s, had kind of withered away, and by 1824 they were extinct. They were gone. The Federalist Party had collapsed by 1820. So this actually is the last time. This is one of the few times in history, I think it's the only time in history, that all the candidates were from the same party, because there was only one political party in the United States. The other one had dissolved. It had lost in its population, well, popularity, I should say, not population. It had lost its popularity within the United States, and it was no longer a major party anymore. It was gone. The 4 candidates were the following. You had John C. Calhoun, who had been President Monroe's Secretary of War from South Carolina. You had William Crawford, who was the Secretary of the Treasury under President Monroe. You had Representative Henry Clay, I'm sorry, not Senator, the Speaker of the House at the time, and then you had former military general from the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson, who was entering the race, very much as a populist candidate. Jackson had not been a politician at any point in his life, and was very much one of the first people to actually be raised on the back frontier. He was very much the outdoorsman. Well, not like Teddy Roosevelt, but when I say outdoorsman, he wasn't raised in wealth. He wasn't raised in a wealthy part of a family. He had grown up on the frontier. He had been the common man, basically. He had worked his way up. Now, although Adams and Jackson ended up being the front runners in the election, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy were the front runners, no candidate actually won a majority of electoral votes because of the split between 4. None of those candidates, even though Jackson and Adams had the more votes than the other remaining 2, or other remaining 3, it was 5 total, really, if you count John Quincy, they still didn't have a majority of the electoral votes, which, remember, it's whoever has a majority. Well, there's no one that had a majority. So this is one of the rare instances in history where we had to use the contingency plan in the Constitution, where it stated that if there is no majority, the House of Representatives must decide the election. So this causes the House of Representatives to have to decide the 1824 presidential race. Now, Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House. Now, keep in mind, he had been one of the political candidates, and he is also Speaker of the House. So although he may not be winning this election, he very much has sway over who is going to. And he ends up siding with Adams and garnering enough support to make Adams the winner. Why? Because Clay was very much a proponent to Jackson. He hated Andrew Jackson. And he thus saw you got 2 options. You got either John Quincy Adams or you got Andrew Jackson. Clay automatically pretty much had made up his mind and said, I am not supporting Jackson because of his populist policies that are not really, they're not brought up with education. He's not an educated man. He's just making these for his own selfish benefit, blah, blah, blah. He's not really going to be a good politician because he's never been one. And Clay actually gets enough of the people in the House of Representatives to vote for Adams as the president. Jackson automatically sees what Clay had did and actually resigns his Senate seat. He was a senator at the time, and he and his supporters start calling the election a corrupt bargain, basically. It was the steal, basically. And you could very much draw a comparison to Andrew Jackson's loss in 1824 to the very recent loss that former President Donald Trump just suffered in 2020, where both sides at both times claim that either back in Jackson's time it was called a corrupt bargain, where in this new little episode in 2020, former President Trump was basically calling it a steal, that someone had stolen the election. Well, in 2020, that was not the case. I mean, I think more than enough evidence is out there to prove that it was not, and that's just the ramblings of a little baby that couldn't exactly stand that he lost. But in the case of 1824, this would actually probably be legitimately called a steal. This was very much an election that had been swayed by one man, and that was Henry Clay. So in the case of the 1824 election, it was a corrupt bargain. It kind of was a steal compared to the 2020, which was really just the ramblings of a man that couldn't get over the fact that he lost. So John Quincy Adams ends up becoming president and takes office in March of 1825, because remember back then, presidents took office in March. Now, Adams does not have the most eventful presidency. He really doesn't at all, because although Jackson may have lost the election, a number of his supporters are the majority in Congress. So a lot of the congressional members are actually Jackson's supporters. So you got a situation here where you got a president on one end who's got a Congress against them. Well, remember, the president, in order to accomplish his agenda, usually has to work with Congress. Well, the whole Congress is basically on the side of his political opponent. The whole Congress is against him. So this very much hinders his presidency and his ability to actually accomplish things and get stuff done. So Adams was not able to accomplish many of the objectives due to this, that Jacksonians, as we could call them, were the main majority in Congress. He proposed a couple things as president. One of the things that he proposed, that he really it was really about one main thing that he proposed, and that was a progressive national program to improve the nation. And this had two main parts. Adams proposed the creation of a national university, which, coming from his background as a very educated man, I can't say I'm surprised that he proposed such a thing, which might not have been a bad idea. Other nations had national universities. Why not the United States? And the second part called for federal funding of an interstate system of roads and canals to better link the nation and encourage the internal development of the country. Adams was very much a supporter, and purporter of internal developments and improvements, such as roads and canals at the time were the big thing, which, if you don't know what a canal is, it's where they, like a hand dug waterway by humans through land to connect one body of water to another, usually, or trying to basically allows boats to go across the middle of the land on a body of water, and they gotta go through locks that changes in elevation and whatsoever. But we're going to discuss canals here much more very soon, because I'm actually studying Ohio's two canals that it once had, and that research is going along very well. So here very soon, we're probably going to have videos on those canals anyway. So we'll worry about discussing what a canal is at that time. But it was very much John Quincy who really wanted to start the internal improvements to the United States' transportation and communication system. Now, critics of Adams, mostly, of course, these Jacksonians in Congress who are Jackson supporters, they argued that the advancements that Adams proposed, such as the building of these roads, the buildings of these canals, the construction of a national university, they argue that it exceeded the federal authority that the Constitution gave them. No, it didn't. It's just you don't want to do it because you don't like the idea that he actually has a good idea. So Adams, although it's a good idea on paper, he isn't really. It doesn't go through. His plan is basically rejected by Congress. It never really goes into effect in the way that Adams had wanted it to. Adams also had sought to provide Native Americans with Western territory, but of course this too went unsupported from the Jacksonians in Congress, because, as we may remember, Andrew Jackson was not exactly an Indian lover. He was not a Native American lover at all. So the idea that his supporters would even consider doing something that would benefit them is probably quite fictional. A fantasy, basically, a fantasy dream. Now, one of the few national accomplishments that did happen during John Quincy Adams' administration, keep in mind, it wasn't really that John Quincy Adams was a bad president. It was just that the Congress he had was too stubborn to really work with him at all. And thus he gets a bad rap for that. But the nation did get one good national achievement during that time frame, and that was the very year that Adams took office in 1825, and that was the year that the Erie Canal was completed in Upper New York, in New York State, and that was actually completed to connect the Great Lakes to the East Coast by connecting Lake Ontario to the Hudson River, which would go down to New York City. Which the Erie Canal is actually still in use today. It's still a used canal within the United States. It was the very first really to be completed. It was one of the most significant. So this is a national achievement. Although it was more sponsored by the state of New York, it was a national achievement that ended up being accomplished during Adams' administration. Now, when Adams ran for re-election in 1828, as we mentioned, because Congress was so stubborn, they were just so stubborn to really support any of his agenda that he wasn't really able to get much done at all. I mean, he proposed stuff, but Congress wouldn't work with him. So in 1828, Adams runs for re-election. However, he suffers a devastating loss to Andrew Jackson, who he faces once again for the presidency, and this time Jackson actually wins by a landslide. The only area that Adams was able to really carry was the New England states, his home. Now, Adams retired in 1830, which by now he had followed in his father's footsteps. He'd become only the second president ever to lose a re-election bid, and the second president so far, as we've discussed, to get only one term in office. Now, Adams retired until 1830, and then he decided he was going to get involved in politics again, and he ran for election and won it to the House of Representatives. There, he actually became a very prominent speaker in the House during his final years, and he was a supporter of freedom of speech, universal education, and eventually became a very big proponent of the argument that slavery was immoral. He very much became an anti-slavery supporter. However, Adams later died in the Capitol on February 23rd, 1848, after suffering a stroke on the House floor at age 82. He was actually in Congress when he suffered a stroke, and they carried him, I believe, into the Speaker's office, and that is actually where he died. He was age 82 at the time. That was our sixth president. Now, we're going to have some little photos here. Here is the electoral map. The first one, this is the 1824 election. This is very much the corrupt election. This was the one that, unlike the 2021, this was very much a stolen election. This was very much. You can see that the states are evenly kind of split between the 5 different political candidates. Well, 4 in this total. Well, this shows you just how divided the nation was between the 4, and that no candidate could really win that majority at all, and it ended up being the House of Representatives have to decide that decision. Unlike modern debates. This one we have Adams's re-election campaign in 1828. Yeah, 1828, where he lost quite significantly to Andrew Jackson when he ran for re-election that year. The only real area that he captured was around his home state of Massachusetts and New England. And if we do not remember who Andrew Jackson is, of course, most people don't seem to realize who exactly is on their currency. So if you don't exactly know that, look at a $20 bill and you'll get a good photo. If not, this is what you're looking at. This would be the odd-looking haired dude that Adams was constantly in political opposition with throughout his entire presidency, one term in office, throughout his entire post-office career, as Jackson had 2 terms in office, and Adams was very much a opponent in Congress to Jackson's policies. Then here we have a little portrait or a little lithograph drawing, I believe, of a lock on the Erie Canal, which was actually completed in 1825 during not Jackson's, but Adams' term in office, which was probably one of the few big national achievements they got achieved. And remember, the New York State might have funded the Erie Canal, but this also ties to Adams because Adams had been a very big supporter of canals. So this was one canal that got completed. And the Erie Canal, I mean, it's been changed. It's been much more modernized because ships have gotten bigger and the route's been changed a little bit. But it is still in operation to this day. It runs from Buffalo, New York, all the way down to the Hudson River. But this is the lock back in the day, which we're going to discuss canals more before in the near future because of the research I'm doing into my own state's canals, which is the great state of Ohio. And then here, I thought this would be notable because John Quincy Adams does hold a distinction as being the very first president that we actually have a photograph of, because photography is actually coming into image at that time. Prior to this, all we had was portraits, which is all we've seen of these past presidents. So John Quincy is actually the first president to be photographed. Of course, it was after he had left office, but it was later in life, but it's still him. This is taken in 1843, roughly 5 years before he died. So this is a portrait of John Quincy, who was actually the first president or former president to be photographed. And another fun fact here, he was very much a fit president, but a little odd story was that he liked to take skinny dips in the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. Well, on one occasion where President Adams was taking one of his skinny dips, a nearby journalist who was actually a woman, which was kind of odd back in the day, but she was a woman, she kind of found the president. She had wanted an interview with him, so in an effort to get an interview, she took his clothes off the tree he had hung them on and refused to give his clothes back unless he agreed to give her an interview. So, in the case of John Quincy, I think he learned don't leave your pants on trees, especially when there are women around, or journalists in this case. I should actually say that, journalists. Don't leave your pants and your clothes on trees when there's journalists around because they will do anything to get an interview with you. So, he learned the hard way. So I just thought that'd be a little interesting fact to give about him was that he actually was an avid skinny dipper in the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. And on one occasion, a journalist kind of took his clothes from the tree and refused to give them back unless he agreed to give the interview. Now, I presume that she agreed to give his clothes back and he got his clothes back on before the interview was done. I presume that is what occurred, which I believe it did happen, but I thought that would be a little fun fact to put in there. But basically, that wraps it up, I think, on John Quincy. So, for one last little look here at him, this is him. And this was, hold on, and this right here is his father. Father, son. So, that concludes this video for John Quincy. So, that is our 6th president's video. So, we only got 40 more to go. So, yes, that wraps up this one. So, our next video, I believe, is going to be on Andrew Jackson, who was our 7th president, but also around, I think here in June, we're actually going to have some videos on the 2 canals that were in Ohio, which is my home state, which I want to probably talk about a little bit because it also relates to the condition of the canals across the country during the 1820s, during the 19th century, I should say, during the 19th century as a whole. And this very much relates to the technological innovations that were occurring during the 19th century in the United States, which we're going to discuss a little bit with the canals, and then, of course, some other videos that I'm pretty sure we're going to have to consider. But for right now, I think our next one is going to be Andrew Jackson because of the fact that these next 3 presidents, which at this point now we got 2 more that we got to do consecutively, because of just how they kind of relate to each other as they go into office and leave. So we're going to discuss them as our next few videos that we have. So for our next video, we're going to have Andrew Jackson, which we might have. I think I plan on having it this weekend, but we'll see how that goes. I know timing is not always, as of late, is not very accurate, but we'll see. Hopefully I can keep that promise. But yeah, that is our plan for right now. So as always, any questions, any comments, put them in the comment section down below. Like the video if you've liked it. If you're enjoying the videos, like it. If you are seeing yourself coming back all the time, every once in a while, and watching some of the videos, be sure to subscribe. That way you know when there are more videos coming out. Any suggestions, as always, comment section as well. If you got any suggestion for any topic videos that you would like me to cover, I'd be more than happy to do one that is suggested. So, as always, I think that wraps it up for today. So, may everyone have a good coming week here, and we will hopefully see you all back for the next video. So, have a good night, and may God bless you all.